Welcome to an evening with Omar El Akkad and Kamila Shamsie. Tonight, we gather to explore narratives that reveal the complex layers of our shared humanity, stories that refuse easy answers and bring us face to face with questions that linger long after the final page. Bringing these stories to life tonight is Kamila Shamsi, our inaugural writer in residence, who has captivated readers and challenged conventions for decades. She is the author of 8 novels, including the award winning Burnt Shadows and Home Fire. Each reminds us of the emotional and moral connections that bind us, transcending geography and time. Kamila, thank you as always for joining us tonight and for showing us how storytelling can foster empathy and understanding across cultures and experiences. Our guest tonight is Omar El Akkad, a visiting fellow at Georgetown University in Qatar as part of our energy humanities efforts within the Energy Studies program. He is an acclaimed Egyptian-Canadian writer whose work, much like Camila's, challenges us to embrace complex truths. Set against the backdrop of a second American Civil War and ecological disaster, Omar's debut novel, American War, offers a powerful vision of the future, one startlingly rooted in the social and political divisions simmering in the present. By portraying the devastation wrought by entrenched partisanship and environmental collapse, American War becomes less about what might happen and more about what is happening, around us, to us, and more often than not, by us. A breakout success, the novel catapulted Omar into the literary spotlight and is even part of the curriculum in some GUQ courses today. Omar's most recent novel, What Strange Paradise, brings the plight of refugees to life through the eyes of Amir, a young Syrian boy washed ashore after a harrowing journey across the Mediterranean. Told through a dual perspective, What Strange Paradise reveals the harsh realities of displacement, illuminating both the indifference and the humanity that coexist in response to suffering. Through characters like Amir and his unexpected protector, Vanna, Omar dismantles the us versus them mentality, exposing the shared fears, hopes, and heartbreak that define the refugee experience. Before turning to fiction, Omar built a career as a journalist, covering some of our time's most pressing issues for some of the world's leading news outlets, including the New York Times and The Guardian. Drawing on his experiences from reporting on the war on terror to uncovering the trauma of Guantanamo Bay, his journalistic background has lent an unflinching authenticity to his storytelling. Headlines may report events, but Omar's stories convey their weight, giving voice to the silent struggles that are often overlooked. Through his body of work, Omar gives voice to characters in flight, fleeing war, persecution, and violence. And yet, paradoxically, his stories bring us closer to home. Whether it is Sarat, a young girl hardened by war in American War, or Amir, a child adrift on foreign shores in What Strange Paradise, his characters capture something universal in the struggle for survival, the search for safety and identity. Omar, it's truly a privilege to have you with us and to engage with the vital questions your work brings to light. As we step into the worlds that Kamila and Omar have crafted, let us prepare to see ourselves more clearly through their eyes. What we may find is a call to think more deeply, to care more profoundly, and perhaps to act more responsibly. Now, I would like to take a moment to extend my sincere thanks to Georgetown professors Dr. Trish Kale, Dr. Victoria Gugassian, and Dr. Firat Orich. Their efforts in hosting Omar as a visiting fellow have enriched both the Energy Humanities program and our intellectual community. Thank you. On that note, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Gugassian, Assistant Professor of American Literature at GUQ and co-coordinator of the Energy Humanities Research Initiative. Her work, which examines the intersections of narrative, the environment, and culture, provides valuable context for tonight's discussion within Energy Humanities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gugassian to the podium.
Thank you, Dean Masri. Hello, everyone. I'm going to try not to take up too much of our time tonight because I know we all want to get to the main event. But I do want to welcome you to tonight's event on behalf of the program in Energy Humanities and on behalf of my fellow coordinators of the program. And to say as well that we're very grateful to the GUQ Dean's Office for supporting and facilitating tonight's event. I want to take this opportunity to explain to you what might seem like an unlikely confluence. Why has a program devoted to the academic study of energy chosen to invite an internationally renowned best-selling novelist to campus? Our program was created to study the ways that energy, its extraction, distribution, and use shape the very details of our everyday lives. In Doha, we are all aware that we live at one important node in the globe-spanning network of relations constituted by energy. One way or another, it is our place in that network that has brought many of us to make this city home. But energy also shapes our day-to-day lived experience, creating structures of feeling, forms of identity, and imagined futures. There's nothing abstract about this fact. The material and emotional worlds of energy are always with us. To take but one example, it is high-carbon energy systems that facilitate, for many of us, our connections to home and family, whether that be through the flight you're anticipating making to visit far-flung relatives and long for places abroad, or through the favorite meal that you can only cook because the ingredients were brought in on a plane or a container ship. Whether we like it or not, we all feel strongly about energy. We are attached to these ways of life, and these feelings form the conditions of possibility for how we imagine our environmental future. I would argue that there are few writers who help us think more vividly about this state of affairs than Omar El Akkad. Omar's 2017 novel American War tells a story about an energy transition that comes too late and fails to make a better future for many, in part because it does not account for the powerful attachments to fossil fuels that I have just asked you all to recognize. Set half a century from now, in the 2070s, American War imagines a fractured future for the United States, in which 4 southern states secede from the Union in response to federal legislation that bans the use of fossil fuels. As Omar writes of this imagined future, once fossil fuels were a worthwhile currency, valuable enough to keep the Louisiana ports and Texas refineries economically viable, even if not flush with cash like in the previous century. But as the rest of the world learned to live off the sun and the wind and the splitting and crashing of atoms, the old fuel became archaic and nearly worthless. The refineries were shuttered and the drills were abandoned, even as the rebel states chose open warfare over prohibition. In the opening sequence of Omar's novel, petrol-powered watercraft ply the waters of the flooded Mississippi Delta, and the sound and smell of their engines is the very expression of their operators' social and political independence. When I first read the novel, this future felt familiar. It only takes looking askance at the world around us to see it already taking shape. Needless to say, this is not the future that many of us have been conditioned to imagine by the often hopeful rhetoric of energy transition, which assumes that decarbonization must necessarily create a better life for everyone. But Omar, as he told us at our December 2023 conference on the global cultures of energy, is a specialist in the stone-cold bummer. That's his words. His novels refuse to let us live with the comforting narratives of progress or to overlook the violence and dispossession that such narratives must, by necessity, render invisible. His work is in many ways a warning about what happens when we do not question our preferences for pleasant fantasy, whether for the powerful forces of our nostalgia for a supposedly simple past or the seductive myths of triumphant progress for the future. But this is not to say that Omar's work wallows in pessimism or forswears hope. Rather, as he has put it, he refuses to grant us hope merely as an epilogue, the pretty consolation we reach for after we have forced ourselves to contend with the world in all its difficulty and violence. Instead, he insists, again, these are his own words, that we take hope as a prologue, the starting point for the hard work of imagining and creating a different future, one that reckons with the injustices of the past and present. On this point, I should also tell you that the title of American War is a bit of a red herring. It is true that the novel tells the seemingly timely story of a Second American Civil War, but it is not only, or one might argue, even primarily, a novel about America, though we as Americans, speaking from my country people, stand to benefit from reading it. It is instead a work that is deeply informed by Omar's experience as a journalist documenting America in the world, in particular the conflicts that that U.S. interests have instigated, prolonged, and intensified. In the story it tells, we find the echoes of the atrocities at Guantanamo Bay, the massacre at Sabra and Shatila, and we also find the inversion of the U.S.'s imperial relationship to the many nodes of the energy network on which its waning global influence so thoroughly depends. Omar's stated intention in writing such a novel is to give his readership in the global north a message that it needs to hear now more than ever, that there is no such thing as exotic suffering. We are all of us caught up in the same global energy systems that deliver to some of us the pleasures of a high carbon lifestyle at the cost of others' dispossession, disenfranchisement, and death. I would argue that it is one of Omar's great gifts as a writer to bring these systems to life on the page, not as a dry schematic, but as a vivid world of believable people caught up in impossible realities. And yet his characters are not mere victims. Though they are products of the systemic violences that shape their lives, they are nonetheless also compelling actors who choose to shape their world in return. In doing so, these characters push us beyond tired debates about the limits and affordances of empathy, asking us not merely to feel for one another, but to understand one another's choices and commitments. Close to the end of American War, one character says the following to the protagonist, who is a woman on the verge of committing unthinkable violence. Quote, "I should believe that you're worth loving, but I don't. So many terrible things made you this way, but I don't have to live with what made you. I have to live with what you are. And I know you don't find me worth loving either, but I'll love you anyway." If American War takes hope as a prelude, I think it's here, in the suggestion that living with one another requires not some cheery, unthinking expression of empathy, but the hard work of coming to terms with the circumstances that make us what we are. Lastly, Omar brings with him one other important qualification that I should tell you about for this event tonight, in that his visiting fellowship represents a homecoming of sorts. He spent much of his childhood and adolescence here in Doha. He moved to Qatar from Egypt as a child when his father took a job in the city's rapidly expanding hospitality sector, and he is thus well positioned to help us more clearly see Doha in all its complexities, including its intersecting communities brought together by global relations of energy. We are all, I think, familiar with the common story of Qatar as a place shaped by the fortunes of its energy resources and its corollary influence in the arena of global politics. But Omar has spoken movingly about Doha as a city in many ways knitted together by people's stories of displacement and migration, and about his experiences here as an inspiration for his interest in centering such stories in his own writing. We are incredibly lucky to benefit from the perspective he brings and the insight with which he invites us to see the spaces constituted by energy systems and the people who inhabit them in a fresh and defamiliarizing angle. His career so far has reflected the brilliance and immediacy of his perspective and his beautiful, uncompromising writing. American War, as the Dean mentioned, has won numerous awards and has been translated into 13 languages. His second novel, What Strange Paradise, was published in 2021 and was awarded the Giller Prize for Fiction. It is a heartbreaking novel, as I think you got the sense from the Dean's introduction, and I have to admit that it made me sob openly for its last 30 pages, but nonetheless, I would highly recommend it. Omar's nonfiction debut, entitled One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, is described by the publisher as a powerful reckoning with what it means to live in a West that betrays its fundamental values. It is forthcoming from Penguin Random House early next year. As you all no doubt know, we are also very pleased that tonight's event also features Georgetown Qatar's inaugural writer-in-residence, Kamila Shamsie, who brings her unmatched skills as an interviewer to this conversation. Kamila has asked me to keep her bio to a minimum to save more time for the main event, but I will tell you or remind you that she's an award-winning novelist who's authored 8 critically acclaimed novels. And I'm sure that many of you in our community are already familiar with her work with the amazing events that she's been organizing at GUQ this fall. So now please join me in welcoming these two fantastic writers, Omar El Akkad and Kamila Shamsie, to the stage.
Thank you, Dean Masri and Professor Gagosian, for those two excellent introductions. I could have sat here listening to introductions for a very long time. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you. I'm going to start by picking up on something that Professor Gagosian said in her introduction, where she said, you might be surprised that we have a award-winning, internationally renowned novelist here in energy humanities, and I think she's right, you might well be surprised, for the reason that surprisingly few novelists take up what should be the central defining issue of our time, our attachment to energy systems and the cost that comes from it. And I'm going to start in a slightly personal ramble, if you'll allow me, which is, a few years ago it did occur, I looked around and I thought, why aren't more of us writing about this? And I thought, well, my next book, I will. And then as I was writing my next book, that entire storyline that was to do with energy systems disappeared. And in its place came another storyline which had to do with the UK's treatment of its migrants. And I thought then of something that John Hersey said, which I want to put to you. John Hersey, of course, best known as a journalist, as one of the great American journalists of the 20th century, and particularly for being the journalist who was the first to go into Hiroshima and wrote about what he saw there in what was a single issue New Yorker piece, which then became a book called Hiroshima. He was also a novelist. And saw that as his much higher calling. And at some point in an interview, he said, the thing about journalism is you can be given an assignment and go somewhere and write about whatever you've been told to write about. But fiction comes from a place that is very, very deep inside you. And it has to be deep inside you in order for the fiction to emerge. And I had to contend for myself with the fact that, embarrassing as this was for me to recognize, somehow that other storyline to do with the climate catastrophe and energy hadn't got deep inside me in the way it really should have. My starting question to you, if you buy Hersey's line, and maybe you don't, did it get inside you, or was it that there were other things inside you and the story of energy and climate became a useful tool for getting those other things out?
Thank you for doing this, first of all. Really, really appreciate it. A few years back, Margaret Atwood came to Portland for the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, they asked me to do the interview. And so we're sitting on the side of the stage as Andrew, the guy who was doing the introductions, excuse me, he's going through our bios, and he goes through Margaret Atwood's bio, which takes about 2.5 hours. And then he has the unenviable task of trying to stretch out my bio so that it takes up as much time. And so towards the end, it was just like, he likes sandwiches. I don't know, he was running out of things to say. So anyway, I just want to thank you for telling them to keep your bio short, because that would have been deeply embarrassing for me. But thank you for doing this. I had the same problem, which is this notion, I think, particularly living in the US, living in Canada, there's a sort of broad umbrella of social justice, right? And everything falls under social justice. And and a particular kind of well-meaning liberal has a real hard time touching certain issues because am I appropriating, but then climate change comes along and it's this umbrella thing, and surely I can sort of engage with that, excuse me, because it's affecting all of us. And so, and then of course, as soon as you start to pick away at it, you realize that all of the underlying issues holding this up, that there is no such thing as climate justice in a vacuum. It doesn't exist. I'm not going to go out and picket a hurricane. That's not how any of this is going to work, right? you see the hierarchy of who's jumping off the cliff first, who's going to get pushed off the cliff first.
Yeah.
And so for me, there was an attempt, and I'm not saying I succeeded in this at all, but there was an attempt to trick my way into talking about these other issues via this vehicle, which is, to me, not even a subgenre of writing. You can't write about anything right now and not contend with what we're doing to the earth. And to me, there's no such thing as climate fiction any more than there is memory fiction or love fiction. It's a facet of what it means to be in the world. And so, particularly with something like American War, with this first novel, the idea is to sneak your way into the room, pretending to be talking about one thing, and actually be talking about something else entirely. The problem with that, of course, is that you risk not getting that point across at all. But for me, climate change was very much about this idea of stubbornness, about this notion of, in the book, there's other ways of making energy now. There's sustainable fuel, there's all the rest of it. And yet there's still a part of the country that just refuses, purely on the grounds that this is how we've always done it. And so to me, it was an avenue to talk about stubbornness, which I think of as sort of fundamental to the human condition. But there are a lot of people who are not going to see it that way. There's a lot of people who are going to see it as, oh, this is a commentary on fossil fuel use, and okay, great. But for me, there's always something that I'm trying to sneak into the room with me at the same time.
What do you think that stubbornness is about? I mean, stubbornness, it's an interesting thing to look at when it's a stubbornness that exists even in defiance of all kinds of facts that are happening and fires that are burning around you. And we're seeing a lot of that stubbornness in the world, that I believe this and I'm going to stand my ground on this point because this is who I am.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two factors that come to mind. The first is just the magnitude of the thing that you have to admit once you stop being stubborn. I mean, there's a reason the new book is called One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. Because at some point enough time will have passed that now, have you ever talked to anybody ever who wasn't always against apartheid in South Africa? Everybody was, like it's sort of, there comes a point at which it's safe to say the thing you have known for a very long time. But up until that point, you are carrying this giant bag of all the things you now have to admit you were wrong about, and the magnitude of the suffering that came as a result. So I think that's one facet of it, and I think that's a fairly universal one. There's another that at least I see a lot more of in the part of the world where I live now, in North America and the West generally, which is the notion of I think most people behave according to the worst thing that could plausibly happen to them. And I think for some people, the worst thing that could plausibly happen to you is that your house, your neighborhood gets razed, your children get killed, the worst of what we do to one another. But if you're living in a position of relative privilege, the worst plausible thing is you and I are talking right now and it gets awkward because we have a slightly different opinion on something. Or you're sitting at a dinner party and someone says something passive aggressive and it gets weird. And so you behave as though that were the apocalyptic thing, which causes a kind of stubbornness that when you tear it apart is so frivolous and so meaningless. But people are behaving in a mode of trying to avoid the worst possible thing, and the worst possible thing just happens to be slight inconvenience or discomfort at a cocktail reception. So I think both those things factor into these really infuriating moments where you're looking at someone and saying, surely you must see this. You must see, and they shake their heads at you. And I'm sure I've been guilty of that numerous times. But maybe I'm more oblivious when it comes to me and less oblivious when it comes to other people.
And of course, the other fact is, of course, it's never the worst it's not true that the worst possible thing that could happen is some awkwardness. I mean, a bomb could fall on our heads from somewhere at any moment. But to contend with that reality would require, it's much easier to not, you can have the privilege of not having to contend with that reality, even though it's always the reality, right? So there's a kind of blindness that is built in to everyone's lives, and it's a sort of systemic thing. Um, one of the things that I found so fascinating with American War, speaking of systemic things, in some ways it is the classic revenge story, right? I mean, it's Gladiator 1 and 2. You did something terrible to my family, I will do something terrible to you. But it's absolutely not that, because the whole point of Gladiator and a lot of these sort of American stories of revenge is it's about the power of the individual. The individual decides, you have wronged me and I will now come for you. And the individual can do that. And even if you is a system, within these stories, that system is always really centrally held up by one person. And if you get that one person, the system will collapse. And you completely, I mean, it's not sort of, when I realized what you're doing, there's a point where I started laughing, although it's not a funny book, but because it was so well done that story of the individual and revenge, actually in the way you tell it is the opposite of that, because the avenging figure is being manipulated and is part of something much larger. And whatever vengeance she takes is never going to be enough, because an entire system came for her. And it's larger than anything she can do about it. So can you talk a little about the kind of the individual and the systemic within a story?
Did I ever tell you the story of the Chinese edition of American War?
No.
So many years ago, I get this email from my publisher telling me that the Chinese publisher wants to buy the China market rights to this book. And I was like, yeah, great, sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know anything about this publisher. All I know is that they don't like the title. They're going to change it to something. And so fast forward a few months later, I get a copy of this thing. Obviously, I can't read the title. I go to my friend who can, and I say, hey, what does this say? And he looks at it and he says, it says nobody survives. So, spoiler alert, if you haven't read American War. I was not kidding about the stone cold bummer thing. There's certain writers that I will read on anything. I go back and read James Agee's film reviews. I don't really care what he thought of those films. I just love the man's writing. I'll read Toni Morrison on anything. I'm not that caliber of writer. I can't write about anything. I have to write about what feels necessary to me, and that often overlaps with what makes me angriest. And the things that make me angry are not individual cases of wrongdoing, they're systemic. I think there's a kind of fundamental fraudulence that has to hold up any unjust system. And our collective ability to let that be, I think, is one of the things that sort of infuriates me the most. And essentially, I mean, American War is that. It's talking about systems, but you can't write a novel about systems. You sort of hone it down and you collide it with the individual. And that's essentially all I was trying to do with American War. I wasn't thinking, I mean, there's a section in that book. When you start writing these things, you think, at least I thought when I was first starting out, that, here's the thing I want to say, and surely that will be the thing that's going to be received, right? And then of course you get into this and you realize that that's entirely untrue. And the defining example for me had to do with in the middle of that book. The middle chapters of that book take place in a camp for internally displaced Americans. There's this thing called Camp Patience. It's a refugee camp. And towards the end of that section, there's a massacre. And that massacre is based note for note on the massacre at Sabran Shatir. And, Sabr, patience, Camp Patience, that's where the name of the thing comes from. Now, in the US, they don't teach that in high school. Nobody has any idea what the hell I'm talking about. And so I would do these book club events, and I would keep getting the same question over and over again. Why is this so brutal? Why did you really have to make it this bad? And I would try to explain, this is from the witness testimony of what happened. The tether was short, this thing that I'm anchoring it to. But I would get that question over and over again. And then I did a virtual event with an Egyptian book club in Egypt who got the reference immediately. It wasn't far away from them, right? And the first question I got that day was, well, if this is based on Sabr and Shatir, why did you tone it down so much? They were reading a different book, an entirely different book. And that to me is the thing I can't bridge. I write overwhelmingly about systems that I think are inherently unjust, and about the collective cowardice, including my own cowardice, in holding up those systems. But I find that the limiting factor, in addition to my own talent or lack thereof, is how do you have this conversation with somebody who is looking at an entirely different thing than what you're looking at? How do you bridge that? And to this day, I honestly have no idea.
It is that question we get asked a lot, isn't it? Who is your intended audience? As though that's a thing for a writer to have in mind as a possibility, because it's always the unintended audiences or the unthought of audiences who anyone can be an audience to your book, and surprising people will pick it up, or unsurprising people will pick it up, and they will read it differently. And however much you might think, I'm going to write against this narrative, it is telling. And I do find it increasingly depressing that however much you do as a novelist, whatever you do, how much you think, I'm really, really, really in every possible way going to write against this stereotype. I'm going to undercut it everywhere. And there will be someone who will read exactly that stereotype into it, because that is what they bring to it, right? And as you say, there's not a whole lot we can do about it, except there are always the mid ground, which is the people who aren't so stuck on their ideas and will shift a little. But yeah, we send books out in the world and things happen to them that we wouldn't want happening to our books.
It's the curling metaphor. You let go of the rock and you just watch it slide down the ice, and you're like, I hope it ends up over there. That's a weird Canadian reference to throw in a place that probably doesn't have a curling club. I realize this. Yeah, I mean, to me, there's something like really fascinating about that, because particularly in the West, there's this kind of like load-bearing beam of MFA writing advice, which is, show, don't tell, the iceberg principle, where you know this much about a story, you only show the reader this much. And that's all well and good if you've had the Victorians yelling on your behalf for however many decades, and you can call your book As I Lay Dying and not be afraid that nobody's going to get the reference. When you're pulling from different lineages, and this is one of the ways, there are many ways that I come back to Qatar and I feel completely uncomfortable in my own skin because somebody has laid 3 different cities on top of the city I grew up in. But one of the ways in which I do feel comfortable in my own skin is that I meet people who know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about many different lineages at once, right? When you're doing that within the context of writing, you can no longer make the assumption that you can show, not tell. The poet, Egyptian-American poet Maro Hilal has this line that I go back to all the time. They will say, show, don't tell, but that assumes most people can see. And so you're in that position. To give you an example, this is a very dumb example, but from the second novel, What Strange Paradise, there's this island, it's a Greek island, and it's a bit of a tourist trap. Along the coast, there's all these nightclubs, and one of the characters is pretty upset because one nightclub keeps blasting the same rap song over and over again. And I never quite tell you what the rap song is, but if you read between the lines of the description, it's Big Pimpin' by Jay-Z. Okay? Fast forward to the end of the book, there's a boat headed towards the island. There's a lot of Arabs on board. Somebody hears music in the distance and says, hey, our people are nearby. That reference makes absolutely no sense unless you understand that Big Pimpin' by Jay-Z samples a mid-20th century Egyptian pop song called Khusara Khusara. Right. The number of people whose cultural knowledge base overlaps Jay-Z's back catalog and mid-20th century Egyptian pop is me and like 3 other people, right? So what do? You either spell it out, in which case you've fallen on one side of the tightrope where now it's overt and it's, it's bad writing, or you don't spell it out, in which case it was never there at all because they're not going to get it. And so what you're left with is a central piece of advice that quite simply does not apply to somebody with your life experience. What do you do with that? I mean, I tried writing a short story for an anthology that came out earlier this year. It was an anthology of, I forget what the acronym is. There's some acronym in the West that's like North Africa, the Middle East, Iran. It's like 14 different letters, whatever. And it was a collection of short stories. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to do a hyper-realistic story based on my time in Doha College in the mid-90s. Unless you went to Doha College in the mid-90s, you're not going to get a single reference. I'm not going to explain any of it. And in the introduction to this anthology, the editor was like, and El Akkad's story set in glittering Dubai. He didn't, like, he just completely went over, you know.
Yeah.
And again, you just sort of have to live with that, because the fundamental piece of advice assumes an existence that I certainly don't have, and I would imagine a lot of people in this room don't have.
Do you know the novel Assembly by Natasha Brown?
Oh, what is that?
Came out in Britain. It was a very big deal, but it was again one of those funny things where it was a big deal for this one particular reason. And she's writing about a young black British woman who is doing very well in the corporate world, has the white aristocratic English boyfriend, and just how race works within all these things. And it's sort of, it's quite a skewering social satire. When I say slightly obvious, I don't mean in a disparaging way. I mean just in the way that a lot of other books have been. And then about 2/3 of the way through, the narrative stops, and there's this long essay on basically racism. And then that essay finishes and we get to the end of the novel. And a lot of people were like, well, it's great. There's that weird, what was that all about? And actually what that's all about is Natasha Brown saying, okay, so I'm writing this kind of novel. I think that's what she's doing. I'm writing this kind of novel that relies on subtext and subtlety. Now I have to give you the 30-page essay so you understand my subtext, and now we can have the ending.
Yeah.
It's that sort of thing. And when it was reviewed, no one talked about that. They just read the straight social satire, and then there was this, and it's also very smart on race, but without trying to contend with what is she doing, and this way in which we have to go and rethink the novel form, which is a closed system, it's sort of come up with the alternative idea. But I'm going to just draw us back to something you were saying earlier, because one of the other sort of real life events, historical events, I suppose it's historical now, that you can read very much into your war is Guantanamo, right? I mean, if you're reading it and there's so much in the detail and the description, you're thinking, particularly for those of us who lived through that time and were reading the news reports when they were coming out of what was going on in Guantanamo and what the prisoners, though they weren't called prisoners, detainees were being put through. It's there. And I know that you reported on Guantanamo. And when I read American War, I think this is a book written by someone who has seen that ugliest face of America and has no illusions about the place anymore. And then I'm lucky enough to read an early proof of One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, which is your next book. And one of the surprises to me in that book was you basically admitting that actually you had still held on to some illusions about America, and it's the idea of values and decency and something along those lines, until what's been going on in Gaza and how America has responded and been part of it. I'm interested in that holding on to illusions. Can you sort of talk about that a little? How is it that someone who has seen what happened with Guantanamo, what happened with Afghanistan, what happened with Iraq, and you're certainly not alone in this. I think many of us realized, we still had these illusions. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little about that, and then perhaps read something from the new book.
Sure. Yeah. The short answer, I think, is it comes down to naivete, but more than that, self-preservation.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing an interview once with this guy in England who runs a podcast where I don't know why he does this. I don't know why he thought this was a good idea, but it's a books podcast, but he never reads the books.
Okay.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And he told me because he was afraid that if he read the books, he would spoil them during the interview. I mean, none of this made any sense at all. But anyway,
he didn't want to do the work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's if I were a betting man. Yeah. But we were talking, and about halfway through, he gave me this thing that I'm sure a lot of immigrants have gotten, which is the like, I can't believe you speak English so well, and you know, that sort of thing. It's fine. And I made a dumb joke about it. I usually do. And I was just like, well, you know, actually what I do is I write the novels in Arabic and then I run them through Google Translate. And he believed me. And it was instantly too late to go back. And so the rest of this interview was just the most awkward thing. But you're reminded, right? You're reminded. I was doing an interview in Louisiana where I was talking to a guy, and after the interview, we were just chatting. And again, this thing that I'm sure a lot of immigrants get. He asked me, like, where are you from? And the answer I gave was not satisfactory because he was like, no, where are you really from? So we do the little song and dance where we go backwards in time. And finally we get to Egypt. And I was like, you know, I was born in Egypt. And he looks at me and he nods and he says, yeah, you know, I could hear the Egyptian in your accent. And I was like, no, man, you can't. Like, I've been working on this for a while. Like, you know.
Yeah.
But again, you're reminded. We weren't supposed to come here, right? When I was 5 years old, we moved to Qatar. So this would have been the mid-'80s. And then I spent the next 11 years here. I was here till 98. And we weren't supposed to come here. We were supposed to go to Libya. My dad wanted to get the hell out of Egypt. Political situation was bad. The economic situation was bad. He gets a job in Libya. And he shows up at the airport. And it turns out that the Libyan terrorism watch list has somebody named Muhammad Ahmed on it. So I'm Omar Muhammad Ahmed La'ed. He's Muhammad Ahmed.
Surely every terrorism watch list
like,
has
Muhammad Ahmed's not like the least common, you know, combination of names in the world. But they won't let him in. And so, you know, that job offer falls through. And he ends up growing up here. Or he ends up moving here, and I end up growing up here. In pound for pound, the richest place on earth. Instead of Libya, because of a coin flip at the airport, right? And we get here, and there is this impulse of, you know, when you come from the receiving end of colonialism, yes, there's resistance to it and all the rest of that, but there's also a sense of like, well, maybe that's what the winners sound like. And maybe if my kid is to have a chance, they need to sound. And so I'm at the American International School from the age of 6. I'm at Doha College afterwards, and I sound like this as a result. And I was really proud of that for a really long time, because that place in the distance that I'm looking to, I don't even really care what it is. I care what it's not. You know, I remember sitting on all these conversations with adults, and the topic would switch to politics. And everybody would be like, whoa, hold up. Like, okay, let's move on. Or you like turn on TV. I don't know what the state of censorship is here now, but it used to be that when we had cable for the first time, when there was like a looming sex scene or two people were leaning in to kiss, they would freeze the screen, but then the audio would keep going, which is the creepiest, like it's so much creepier than if it's, but like, I don't care about what the US is, and I don't care about what the West is. I care about what it's not. And so I've developed this sort of fantasy in my head that I go there and I can see what I want, I can read what I want, I can think what I want. And that supersedes everything for a very long time as a function of self-preservation, because I've attuned myself to this place. I sound the way I do because of that, right? Like, and so throughout all of it, and you know, I came of age in the War on Terror years, so you're watching this place that you've attuned yourself to slaughter people who look like you by the hundreds of thousands. And you have to sit and convince yourself of this fantasy that beneath all of this, there's a bedrock of something really good and fun. And I'm sure everybody has their different breaking points, and I'm sure mine came very late in life. But it happened to be this last year. This last year was when you're watching the first live stream genocide in history. And you're being told, and your tax dollars are paying for it, right? I'm paying to kill those kids. And I'm being told every day by the people who are supposed to represent me that this is good and proper and necessary and needs to continue, and that if I'm opposed to it, I'm the bad guy. And something broke. And I'm sure if I was a more moral human being, or if I was a less naive human being, it would have broke much earlier. But it didn't. It broke right now, and this book came out of it. I mean, Gitmo is a surreal place. It's, you know, the year before and the year after. I spent most of 2008 in Guantanamo Bay. 2007, 2009, I was in Afghanistan. So I was watching the physical layer of violence, the bombs and the guns. And Guantanamo was every other layer of violence. Linguistic violence, euphemistic violence, the violence of omission. The first week there, we were touring Camp 4. So they used to keep the prisoners in camps 1, 2, and 3. A bunch of people killed themselves in 1, 2, and 3. They moved everybody to 4, 5, and 6. 4 is medium security, 5 and 6 are supermax. You get 23 and a half hours a day in an isolation cell about the size of this carpet. And so we were touring 4. We were touring the medium security, and I asked the soldier a question. I said, so when do the prisoners, and I got to that word prisoners, and he cut me off, and he said, we don't have prisoners here, sir, we have detainees. And the reason for that is a prisoner implies a prison sentence, which somebody has to define. Even a life sentence, somebody has to define it. Detainees you can hold forever. There were no interrogations in Guantanamo Bay. Of course, everybody was interrogated left, right, and center, but they didn't call it that. They called it a reservation. So detainee 8653 has an 8:30 p.m. reservation. It means that at 8:30 they're going to be taken to the interrogation shacks. When a bunch of those prisoners went on hunger strike to protest their detention, it was not a hunger strike, it was asymmetric warfare. They were conducting asymmetric warfare against their captors. I don't think you can have the physical violence in a vacuum. You need these other layers of violence to hold it up. You need it to be not, whoops, we killed a wedding party. You need it to be collateral damage. You need these things to sanitize what is actually happening on the killing floor. And all of that was overt in Guantanamo. A deeply surreal place. Also the worst bureaucracy I've ever seen in my life. There was a media room, and at 9 o'clock every night they would lock the media room. And if you wanted to go in and file, you had to go get this poor soldier, whoever was on night duty that day, you had to go to the other side, wake them up, bring them over. And we kept complaining, like, nobody's stealing anything in Guantanamo Bay, just leave the door open. And no. Finally, it had to go up to the highest ranks. And then months later, somebody decides we're going to put a little keypad, those number keypad things. So this has to be approved by 18 levels of bureaucracy. Finally, they install the thing. We're like, great, what's the code? They're like, no, after 9 p.m. you have to go get the soldier, and they'll come in. And it was that kind of place. Right. It was a nightmare. Yeah. But the safest, there were little kids playing in the playground in the officers' suburbs. It was surreal. Anyway, so as a result of this last year and my sort of severance with what I thought my relationship with the West was, or what I forced myself to believe it was, I ended up writing this book. And it's a real career ender of a book. And it's my first nonfiction. It's called One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. And this is the prologue. It's not anything like the rest of the book. I'm trying to think. I've read it once before, I think. Anyway, so yeah, it's about trying to figure out who the hell I am in light of the last year. She is fog-colored when they find her. She believes she has ended. Like porters in service of some grotesque nobility, 6 men carry the stretcher out of something cavernous, something that used to be a home. And she, a girl of 9 or 10, is whisked away. Sitting on the stretcher, dazed and bloodied, she looks off to the side. She appears to be searching. The men who carry the stretcher move with urgency, as if the doing of care, of gentleness, can undo what has happened to this girl, to this place, to the bodies yet to be dug from beneath the rubble. Someone nearby asks God for revenge. Perhaps God is here somewhere, also searching. A soldier I met years ago, who made the study of industrial violence his hobby, once told me the first thing that kills when a bomb goes off isn't shrapnel or fire. It's the overpressure wave, air forced violently outward from the site of the blast. What you're supposed to do, he said, is drop to the ground and cover your ears. Breathe out, empty your lungs before the air collides with and flattens them. Of course, if you're close enough, nothing you do or don't do will make any difference at all. He said the force of the overpressure wave weakens in proportion to the cube of the distance from the site of impact, which is to say, the most effective thing you can do to avoid getting killed by a missile or a mine or a grenade is to be far away when it goes off. How do you do that? I asked. Do what? Know when a thing like that is about to happen. Know to be far away. Well, he said, and trailed off. A few minutes later, he was telling the story of a freak accident his daughter has suffered as a toddler, how carrying her to the emergency room was the scariest thing he'd ever experienced. Even in his line of work, even with all he'd seen, the scariest thing. As the men carry the girl out of what used to be her home, she asks if they're going to take her to the cemetery. One of the men says, "Masha'Allah, Masha'Allah." In literal translation, the word means what God wills. A closer approximation of meaning, of one meaning, is something like, what has happened is what God willed. But English, tasked with a word like this, turns stiff and monophonic, and Masha'Allah is orchestral. To any ear that grew up on this language, it is clear that what the man means when he says this word is something else entirely, something instantly familiar to generations who've heard it spilling out the mouths of beaming grandmothers at the end of piano recitals and graduation ceremonies and at the first sight of a newborn. Used this way, it finds its principal purpose as an expression of joy. Look at this wonderful thing God has done. MashaAllah. Language, too, forces the air from the lungs. Beyond the high walls and barbed wire and checkpoints that pen this place, there is the empire. And the empire as well is cocooned inside its own fortress of language. A language through the prism of which buildings are never destroyed, but rather spontaneously combust, in which blasts come and go like Chinooks over the mountain, and people are killed as though to be killed is the only natural and rightful ordering of their existence, as though living was the aberration. And this language might protect the empire's most bloodthirsty fringe, but the fringe has no use for linguistic malpractice. It is instead the middle, the liberal, well-meaning, easily upset middle, that desperately needs the protection this kind of language provides. Because it is the middle of the empire that must look upon this and say, yes, this is tragic but necessary, because the alternative is barbarism. The alternative to the countless killed and maimed and orphaned and left without home, without school, without hospital, and the screaming from under the rubbles and the corpses disposed of by vultures and dogs and the days-old babies left to scream and starve is barbarism. The girl on the stretcher believes she has ended. A man says to her, "Inti zay al-amr." You are like the moon. Again, translation fails. There is no English equivalent to the lineage of this phrase, a lineage that runs through generations of old movies and love songs and family gatherings. Listen to the sly setting joy and pleading, raw pleading, that carries the words as this man tells the girl who lived when so many others died, that she is beautiful beyond the bounds of this world. Zay al-Amr. Something has ended here, but something else begins. The dead dig wells in the living.
Thank you. It's an extraordinary book. You have the first pages of it, and it goes on, and it is clear. It has a clarity which feels necessary. And as you're reading, I was thinking of something Professor Gagosian said in her introduction about how there's this narrative we're fed around energy transition. It'll happen, right? Energy transition is going to happen, and then it'll be okay. It'll happen before it's too late. Before it's too late is one of those really interesting phrases because is never defined. Before what's too late? And one of the things that, of course, your first book does is show us a world of even when the thing happens, the energy transition happens, there are certain things it's already too late for. And when you were reading that, I found myself saying the phrase in my head, it's too late. I wonder I wonder if you could talk a little, and after that I'll throw it to the audience, about things that maybe you feel it's too late for already. You know, we live in this world where we believe things can be restored or fixed. The bad systems will come down, it'll end. What is it already too late for?
That's such a fascinating question. So I wrote this essay for an anthology. It was a climate change anthology, and actually a lot of it was about Qatar, but part of it was about this research paper I'd read about. There's a body of water somewhere in Iraq that had, I guess it was a lake or river, where the drought had been so severe and the water line dropped so much that they uncovered evidence of an entirely different civilization. And so the whole essay was about this idea of how we think about climate change as being future focused, in large part because that's how we move through time. We move into the future. We can't turn it back. But also because there's an element of almost a self-defense mechanism where as long as it's in the future, we have time to do something about it, right? And so this essay was in large part about how this thing we're doing to the planet isn't just mortgaging the hell out of the future, it's also changing our past, changing our relationship with what was. I think we're one of the most and least merciful things about this particular calamity, which might be the biggest calamity in the history of the species, which might be the last calamity in the history of the species. One of the simultaneously most and least merciful things is that we know what's causing it and we know what to do about it. And in broad strokes, this isn't some alien phenomenon that everyone is. It's not like Arrival. We're not trying to figure out the alien language and communicate with them. Like, we know the thing, and we've known the thing for the better part of 100 years. And so to me, whenever I think of the stuff that can't change, that can't ever change. We can't ever pretend we didn't know when there was still time to do something about it. That has gone out the window. But the tragedy for me is not that we won't survive, it's that we will. We're just going to keep changing the definition of we. We're going to have to keep altering that. It's never too late for something. It's entirely too late now to keep it to 1 degree of warming or 1.5. And every morning we're going to wake up and it's going to be too late for one more of those benchmarks and one more of those things. And that is an abstraction when you're talking about numbers, but it's also millions and millions of deaths, right? But there's no switch, right? There's no... It would almost be a weird nihilistic kind of relief if there was. Because at one point you just be like, yeah, okay, we're done. It's over. There's nothing we can do, so I may as well enjoy my Amazon packages arriving on the same day for as long as that keeps happening, you know? I got my convenience out of it. But that's not it. We're not opening and closing the door. We're falling down a staircase. And every day it's another step. And so my answer to that question is always this sliding scale. And depending on your outlook for life, that's either a cause for extreme hopefulness, because we can always still do something, or extreme pessimism, because we're working our way up. These solutions are in place after the billionaires start losing their beach houses. We have to wait for the right kind of people to suffer, I suppose. But they're in the very back of the line. And there's people falling off the cliff right now. And I don't know what to do about that. I've picked the most impotent profession, right? Because you write about it, and you have to believe when you're writing that you're going to change the world with this, right? I have to believe with this book that if I'm going to end my career and never be invited to another, literary event again, that it's for a thing.
We will invite you here.
Yeah, you say that now. We'll see about that. But you have to believe that, right? And then you also have to know that none of that is true. It's a weird space to exist in when it's what you've chosen to do with your life.
It may be a space that explains something about, how we and I don't mean we writers, I mean we people, live this sort of two-ness that is so often going on. I mean, you're sitting at a desk writing. It is an immense act of optimism on one hand. It is the optimism, not just, and I don't mean that, people might buy my book, but that you will reach people in this weird way of these squiggles on a page, that the language will reach into them somehow. And at the same moment, it's despairing. I don't mean all writing, but certainly,
whatever the hell this was, yeah.
That it's not, I mean, I think hope would be such a wrong note in there. It's despairing and it's anguished. And these two things are absolutely, you're doing the optimistic thing about anguish and despair. And I think something in that seems to sum up the way we are as people and how we're living, that we hold this knowledge about what we're doing. And the horrific potential, or not potential, the horrific effects of it. And we're doing at the same time.
Yeah, I don't think I could have put it any better, honestly.
I mean, you could have. We both could have if we got to edit it.
If we got to 16 drafts, 16 drafts later.
But I'm going to turn over to the audience now. If you have questions, could you raise a hand and the mic will come around to you. John, in the second row here.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much. So, in reading the American War, I noticed that geopolitics here has been completely shifted, where America is basically downtrodden, and we have the rise of the global South, essentially, such as basically a pan-Arabist Bouazizi empire, right? I wanted to ask you, did you do to what extent did you do this in the framing of science fiction world building? To what extent was that inspired by your rage against the US empire and your expression perhaps of, I don't know, pan-Arabist unity, right? Like, why did you envision it this way, and why did you envision the Arab world as united under one banner?
Sure, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I often say, I don't think of it as an American book by any stretch of the imagination. I often say that if I'd written it 100 years ago, I would have had to call it British War, because the point was not to set it in the US, the point was to set it in the heart of the empire. Jorge Luis Borges once said that all literature is tricks, and no matter how clever your tricks are, they eventually get discovered. My tricks are not particularly clever. My central trick is inversion. I take something that's headed this way and I make it go that way. And so I was inverting something that I'd seen go in the other direction so often that I wasn't even thinking about it anymore. If you think of any James Bond movie or any Jason Bourne movie you've ever seen, there's always a scene on an exotic Caribbean island or a Moroccan bazaar, and it's fully understood that the place is the table, and the tablecloth being laid on top of it is somebody else's story. And what I wanted to do was turn that around and make the empire the table and lay somebody else's tablecloth on top of it. And so once I did that, I realized that I could do it in the other direction as well. And so I took the creation story of the United States and basically applied it to this pan-Arab. There's 5 more Arab Springs, and then after the 5th one, there's this big sort of people's democratic empire that comes out of it. The interesting thing about that is that, nobody in the US has read this book this way. In the US, it's overwhelmingly read as a literal prediction of how a second American Civil War would go down. That's because 3 weeks after I finished the first draft, Donald Trump announced he was running for president. And the book ends up coming out in April of 2017, so like 4 months into the Trump administration. And overwhelmingly it's just read that way. It's like it shows up on all these lists of like the first books of the Trump era and the books you need to read to understand this moment. And that was great for my royalty statement. I sold a ton more books as a result, but there's a chasm between the book I was trying to write and the book that is read, particularly in the West, particularly in North America. And I mean, I was flagrant about it. There's a part of that book where there's a transcript of a speech that the head of the Bouazizi Empire makes in the United States. At this point, the United States is in really bad shape. Things are going horribly wrong. This guy flies over there and he gives the speech. And at one point, my editor during the drafts, the editing process, he comes back to me and he says, listen, man, could you make this like just slightly more sincere? Like, it's clear from the text that this guy does not give a damn about the US, that he's being horribly, horribly insincere what he says about their shared values and stuff. I had copied the speech word for word from Obama's Cairo speech. I had literally changed a couple of the locations and left the rest of it. So I think there were like some copyright issues at a certain point. That's how close it was to. But that's all I was doing. It's this very, very simple trick. It's not particularly creative or brilliant. It's the arrow's headed this way. What if we make it go that way? And from there, the rest of the book sort of came together.
Question back there.
Good evening, and thank you for this really interesting talk. But at the very beginning of your conversation, you mentioned that when you first landed in Doha, you saw like maybe 3 cities built around the city where you grew up, or something like that.
Yeah, just that when I come back 30 years later, it just looks like there's 3 more cities compared to where.
It's because I landed recently in Doha, and I am always dazzled by the. First, I feel sometimes that I can't really locate myself in the city, although it's a very pleasant and it's a very pleasant setting, elegant setting, but there is so many identities within one city, so many cities in one city, and I always contemplate or think about that. So I just wanted you, if you please, to elaborate a little bit on the Doha where you grew up, and what are those 3 mini cities that you see now around the Doha where you grew up. And thank you.
Sure, yeah. So in physical terms, it's just the things they've built up north of West Bay. I don't know what's got the Pearl and that's all. So it used to be, if you look at the skyline, there used to be the Sheraton, there used to be that pyramid, and then a blank space, and then the palace. And now it's obviously not that. What's funny, last night we went out to dinner and we were sort of walking back to Sharm, right? And we go near the, I want to say the Jeddah flyover. We were walking down the street, and out of nowhere, completely subconsciously, a voice in my brain just yells out, "squash rackets." And for a second there, I just had no idea what the hell was going on. Why did my brain just yell squash rackets at me? And then as we get closer to the flyover, I realized that in one corner of that street, 30 years ago was the one sporting goods store where if you wanted a squash racket, that was pretty much the only place you could go. Qatar is the only place that does that to me. I could go back to Egypt now, it wouldn't make a difference. I can go to Canada, any of the places I lived. I can go back to Portland where I've been for 10 years. And there is no bizarre interplay between my conscious and my subconscious in the way that happens when I come here. And it's one of the reasons that I tend to say yes to any invite in Qatar. It's nothing for or against Qatar, I just have a bad back and it's 24 hours of flying. So I generally will say no to flying halfway around the world, except here, because independent of politics or culture or anything at all, there is the place where I became who I was. And if it was completely gone, I would have a different relationship with here. And if it was exactly the same, I would have a different relationship with here, but it's something weird in the middle. The first night I landed here, I was jet lagged. It was like 2 a.m, and I went straight to the Doha Sheraton, because that's where my dad worked, and that's where I spent all of my weekends in the little clubhouse. And of course now they've got 300 security people and metal detectors, all kinds of weird stuff. There's a giant blue rooster in the lobby for reasons that I fully do not understand. But it's there. And I remember being 10 years old and playing tag in the triangular floors, running around. And it's very, very odd to have that simultaneously taken away from you by these 3 new cities, by this massive development, but also to have access to it. Later tonight, I'm going to wander over to the TCBY next to Nassim Gardens, because I used to live in Nassim Gardens and we used to go to the TCBY. And half those restaurants are different now, but that Pizza Hut has been there for 6,000 years and it's not going anywhere. And like, I just don't have that relationship with anywhere else. And so like, regardless my feelings about Qatar or Georgetown or anything, and these people have been incredibly generous to me for, again, no discernible reason, this place just activates my subconscious in a way that nowhere else does.
Of there, lady.
First of all, I just want to say I can't wait to read your next book. That sounded very interesting. When you said like the last year something broke inside you, I feel like a lot of us have felt that way. And I was wondering, with that feeling and writing this book, how did you channel these like emotions to help write your next book?
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I tend to think of anger as a kind of heat. And so, heat is necessary, but if it gets away from you, it's going to burn the whole place down. And it got away from me a lot of the time when I was writing this book. You can see the scorch marks. You can see the places where, I didn't have control over it anymore. I don't know how to do anything else. I'm not charming or witty. I don't have any skill set of any kind, and I knew this from a very early age, that I could write and not do much else. And so it's always been my avenue of first escape. When I need to run out of the room psychologically or conceptually, I run out onto the page. And that's all I've been doing for the last year. Because again, it's not, history doesn't begin last October. But where I live, history absolutely begins last October. And so you're having these infuriating discussions with people. And as it moves into election season, you're having these discussions with all your well-meaning liberal friends who are telling you, yes, but, and Trump will be that sort of thing. And eventually you can't help but hear the same sentence over and over again, which is, listen, I can't afford to have the things that happen to people who look like you also happen to people who look like me. And you see the workings of it. I had to get away from all of that. And I wasn't going to up and move. That's not a very easy thing for me to do. But I could put it down on paper. I don't know if this is a good book. It might be a piece of crap. I honestly have no idea. What I do know is that it was the steam vent without which I would have completely fallen apart. I've cried maybe twice in my life up until the last year. In my adult life, when we buried my father. That was the last time I cried, and that was 14 years ago. And then this last year, I had to find a spot on the outskirts of our property where I could just go, where my kids weren't going to see me. It's not a healthy way to be in the world. And at the same time, it's an incredibly privileged way to be in the world. Because I don't have to worry about my kids being torn limb from limb, and probably our neighborhood is not going to be destroyed, right? So all of this stuff puts you in a place where you don't know what the hell to think anymore. And whenever I don't know what the hell to think anymore, I go immediately to the page. And that's how this book came about. And I kid about it being a career ruiner. It almost certainly is a career ruiner. But also I don't care anymore. Like, there's certain things that used to feel really, really important a year and a half ago that are completely irrelevant to me now. Without which I probably wouldn't have written this book. So we'll see what happens in February.
Can I ask what kind of conversations you're having with your publishers about stuff you'll do around publication? Is it?
Yeah, those have been some weird meetings. Because John, my editor, is like, yeah, we'll book more than you can possibly do, because most of these are going to get canceled. It's interesting because you're dealing with the presumed foundational principles versus the reality, the pragmatic reality. Yeah. And the presumed foundational principles is that this is about the exchange of ideas, and everyone should be able to put. The pragmatic reality is that they're going to get a lot of angry letters, and they're going to get a lot of angry calls from a lot of important people. And to their credit, they haven't changed a word of this. I forced them to change a word of this because you can't see it from here, but there's sort of 2.5 Arabic words in this entire manuscript. There's Masha'Allah and Zay al-Amr. And we went for about 6 months trying to get the typesetting because nobody at Penguin Random House speaks Arabic. And so they would give me back this thing that just looked like gibberish. The letters are going in the opposite direction and they're not connected. And there was a real sense that I was sort of out on an island as a guy who sounds like this, writing a book like this for a publisher like that.
Yeah.
But to their credit, John called me up and asked me to write this. He had come to Portland and I was raving and ranting about how the West didn't make sense to me anymore. And he called me up a few days later and says, put it down on paper. And I had started putting down notes. But once he told me, it was the first time I thought, okay, I'm not completely alone here. And that guy has risked his career for this book, even more than me, because he actually has a job. I'm just unemployed. I go from gig like this to another gig like this. So there have been people within the institution who have been incredibly supportive. The institution is still what it is.
Yeah. Other questions? The fourth row there and then the second row.
Thank you again for those insights. I have a question, and I think I'm going to speak as I'm thinking. You mentioned, like this book could be your career ender, and like how that something broke inside of you when your channel out was putting it down on paper. And I think some of us, maybe you, maybe me, others, have the privilege that we have had that career where we've reached to the point where we can give it up. But I think especially for young people here, and just for context, I teach journalism next door, and I have some of my students who have also felt that thing broke inside of them since last year, but they're too young and they still need to go maybe to grad school or get jobs and those things. And every other day, I have a student who might say like, I really want to write about this, or I want to, tweet about this or post about this, but I'm afraid how that's going to play out, because they've seen the dark side of the empire, but they're also aware that the empire still stands and they need it. So what would be your advice, and it could come from you or Kamala either, like how do young people who want to write about these things, but they're afraid that they're going to get stopped very early on in their career, like what can they do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. I've had my version of that discussion whenever I teach workshops or, go talk to high schools. And it's not something like me coming and prompting the kids to talk about this. This always sort of comes up in the other direction of people describing exactly what you're describing, which is like, I see this thing every day. And I also know that if I talk about it, I'm risking my career and I'm risking my future. And it's much easier for me in the back half of my life with no job prospects and no real employment to be like, yeah, go, do your thing, to someone who is at the beginning of their career and could sort of have repercussions for decades longer than I ever will. The thing I try to get across, which is not really advice, is I try to be as honest about it as I can. All anecdotal evidence I've had over the last year is that it will hurt your career. Particularly if you're Muslim or you're Arab, if you're not white. I've seen it happen left, right, and center. I had a friend of mine have her book club events canceled because the organizer of the book club said, we're canceling it because we stand with Israel. My friend is half Scottish, half Egyptian. You cancel a Scottish Egyptian woman's book club because you stand with Israel? Sure, do whatever you want, I guess. The movie deal for American War fell through. We sent them. We had agreed to their terms in September, late September. The contract went to them in early October, and then we stopped hearing from them. And then in January, they walked away. These are all very petty things, but for some people, it's like the difference between making rent that month or not. So it is actually a huge deal to have it hurt you. And that's to say nothing of like the negative space that you'll never be able to fully outline. You'll never know what interviews never came, what job interviews never happened in the first place, who was thinking of hiring you for something but never picked up that phone. You'll never know the magnitude of that, right? The thing I always go back to is, so the last big event I did before Georgetown, Qatar, was Georgetown in DC. They asked me to come give a lecture there. And I had the day off beforehand, and I decided to walk down to the Israeli embassy to see the place where Aaron Bushnell had set himself on fire. And there's flowers, but then it's also walled off, and there's cop cars, and immediately I got the hell out of there because you don't want to be the one brown guy walking around next to like 13 cop cars. It's not for me to tell anybody to watch the video of what that happened. Of course, it's extremely gruesome, but one of the things towards the very end of that, of that moment is that you have, I think, a security guard and like a paramedic come running towards the flames. And the paramedic is asking for a fire extinguisher. And the security guard is pointing his gun at the flames. And generally speaking, when I talk to young people, I try my best to tell them, look, if your morals are telling you something and you feel for other reasons that you can't speak out and act on those morals, that's perfectly understandable in the world we live in. And you should know that if you don't act out, you will have a much easier life. Everything will be easier for you. And if you do, you're going to be struggling for a very long time. The only upside is that those brief moments where you look yourself in the mirror or where you go to sleep at night won't feel as difficult for you. And generally speaking, all I leave them with is just this sense of like, do you want to be the person who points the gun at the flames, or do you want to be the person with the fire extinguisher? If you're willing to point the gun at the flames, there's always room in the empire for you. Or if you're willing to look away while somebody else points the gun at the flames on your behalf, there's always room in the empire for you. If you're trying to do the other thing, it's going to be an uphill struggle for the rest of your life. And I leave them with that because it would be profoundly unfair for me to try and pretend otherwise. I've seen entire careers ruined. I know people who will never get another book deal, who will never get another gig of any kind. But, you know, you have to weigh that against the tail end when you're thinking about your life and what you did or didn't do and how much you want that to sting. But yeah, beyond that, I can't paint a rosier picture, I don't think.
And the final question in the second row here.
Hi. I wanted to ask, I'm interested in knowing, at this point of your life, what do you think about your identity? So you grew up in between Egypt and Qatar, where you can never be a citizen, and then you moved to Canada, where you can be a citizen, but with a name like Omar or with an imaginary accent, you can never also be from there. You know, you're from here, you're here, you're there, you're not from here, you're not from there. And I'm also interested in, like you said, you have kids. How's that play as well? Do you think that struggle, is it generational in your case? Does it spill out to your kids as well? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. A few months ago, my daughter had a play date. Her friend was over at our house, and they were talking about, you know, where they're from, where their parents are from. And both my kids were born in Portland. My wife's Canadian. We met in college in Canada. And so my daughter was saying something like, well, my dad's Egyptian and my mom's Canadian, and I was born here. So I guess I'm half Egyptian, half Canadian, and half normal. I was sitting there being like, oh my God, I failed you. I failed you horribly. This was like, at one point she told me she wanted to be a writer when she grows up. And I was like, oh, so you know, what does a writer do? Thinking it was a softball question, you know, she said. And so I was like, what does a writer do? And she was like, has Zoom meetings. And I was like, oh my God. So one of the many ways I failed her is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, I mean, you know, I was born in Egypt, but when I go back, it's weird because I walk into the airport and of course they see my name. They don't care if it's an American or a Canadian passport. They're like, Omar, come on, what are you? And they speak to me in Arabic. And when I talk in Arabic, my Egyptian accent is immediate, but I have the vocabulary of a 5-year-old because I've essentially stopped speaking Arabic for the most part when I was young. And so it's weird. They think that I'm playing a trick on them or something, or that I'm trying to be clever. And I get weird friction. Qatar is where all my formative memories happen, but I'm never going to be a Qatari citizen. That's not available to me. Canada doesn't start until I'm 16 years old. And so there's a formative part that just doesn't connect with Canada ever. The longer I spend in the US, the less I know about that country, the more I realize I have no idea how that place works in the slightest. And I don't have a patriotic bone in my body. I'm just not that person. I mean, no offense to anyone who is, that's fine, but I haven't had that kind of life. I got my US passport for pragmatic reasons, because I'm a guy named Omar and I want to have an easier time at the airport. Like that was it. It's not, I went into the citizenship interview and this big dude who had immigrated from Austria like 30 years earlier is interviewing me, and I'm nervous as hell. And he sits me down. He's like, "What do you do for a living?" I was like, "I'm a writer." I was like, "What do you write?" "I write novels." And he looks at me and he says, "I wrote a novel once about the Yakuza," because I went to Japan, and the next 20 minutes of my citizenship interview was this guy explaining to me his seemingly horrible Yakuza novel that he wrote after a week's trip to Japan. And I cannot tell you how excited I was about that book. I mean, I was nodding along, and I was like, "I can't believe this didn't get published. Sounds amazing." So I was a huge coward about it because I wanted my citizenship so that I would have an easier time. This is how I tend to think about the nation state in general, my relationship to the nation state. I got that passport, and the only tangible difference it has made in my life is that a few months later, I won a literary prize worth $100,000. In Canada, they don't tax prize money. In the US, they do. So the only thing I've done was pay $30,000 in taxes on a prize. That's the only thing that passport has done. When my daughter was born, we spent a whole bunch of time thinking about what names would work in both parts of the world. When my son was born, it was an even more difficult conversation because there's fewer names that work in both parts. We have considered in the lead up of this book changing their last names to their mother's last name as a safety precaution. This is me being a coward, right? Me not wanting to take my kids back to Egypt because it's like nothing they have ever experienced. When you grow up in the countryside outside Portland, Oregon, and I take you to Cairo, I may as well be taking you to another planet, right? That's me being a coward. And it's easier for me to be a coward because when I think of my relationship to home, I don't think of geography at all. I think of memory and I think of relationships. So like the TCBY, does it really matter as a location? Not in the slightest. Is that the place where I asked this girl out once and she rightfully turned me down? Yes, right? There's memory and there's relationship, and that to me is the entire connective tissue of my sense of identity. Beyond that, it's just a bunch of acronyms that people in the West have thrown onto me. First time I heard BIPOC, I thought it was bisexual people of color, and I was just like, that's oddly specific, like I don't, that stuff is not part of how I think about myself. To me, it's purely memory and relationship, which again is why I'm incredibly grateful to be here. It's like a whole bunch of lights going off at once, and it's a really surreal experience.
I think a whole bunch of lights going off at one moment is an excellent place at which to end. Thank you for that splendid conclusion. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for being here. I think you might be willing to sign books if people have them outside.
Happy to.
There'll be a little reception, so please join us out there. And please join me in thanking Omar El Akkad.